can stand a practical joke, as can any man who has been afloat. I'll call and see him, and tell him so." Before he started, Bob bethought him of something which would still further prove to the misapprehending John that he was entirely forgiven. He went to his room, and took from his chest a packet containing a lock of Miss Johnson's hair, which she had given him during their brief acquaintance, and which till now he had quite forgotten. When, at starting, he wished Anne good-bye, it was accompanied by such a beaming face, that she knew he was full of an idea, and asked what it might be that pleased him so. "Why, this," he said, smacking his breast pocket. "A lock of hair that Matilda gave me." Anne sank back with parted lips. "I am going to give it to Jack, he'll jump for joy to get it. And it will show him how willing I am to give her up to him, fine piece as she is." "Will you see her today, Bob?" Anne asked with an uncertain smile. "Oh no, unless it is by accident." On reaching the outskirts of the town he went straight to the barracks, and was lucky enough to find John in his room, at the left-hand corner of the quadrangle. John was glad to see him, but to Bob's surprise he showed no immediate contrition, and thus afforded no room for the brotherly speech of forgiveness which Bob had been going to deliver. As the Trumpet-Major did not open the subject, Bob felt it desirable to begin himself. "I have brought ye something that you will value, Jack," he said, as they sat at the window, overlooking the large square barrack yard. "I have got no further use for it, and you should have had it before if it had entered my head." "Thank you, Bob. What is it?" said John, looking absently at an awkward squad of young men who were drilling in the enclosure. "'Tis a young woman's lock of hair." "Ah," said John, quite recovering from his abstraction, and slightly flushing. Could Bob and Anne have quarrelled? Bob drew the paper from his pocket, and opened it. "Black," said John. "Yes, black enough." "Whose?" "Why, Matilda's." "Oh, Matilda's. Whose did you think then?" Instead of replying, the Trumpet-Major's face became as red as sunset, and he turned to the window to hide his confusion. Bob was silent, and then he, too, looked into the court. At length he arose, walked to his brother, and laid his hand upon his shoulder. "Jack," he said, in an altered voice, "you are a good fellow. Now I see it all." "Oh no, that's nothing," said John hastily. "You've been pretending that you care for this woman that I mightn't blame myself for heaving you out from the other, which is what I've done without knowing it. What does it matter?" "But it does matter. I've been making you unhappy all these weeks and weeks through my thoughtlessness. They seemed to think at home, you know, John, that you had grown not to care for her, or I wouldn't have done it for all the world. You stick to her, Bob, and never mind me. She belongs to you. She loves you. I have no claim upon her, and she thinks nothing about me. She likes you, John, thoroughly well, so does everybody, and if I hadn't come home, putting my foot in it, that coming home of mine has been a regular blight upon the family. I ought never to have stayed. The sea is my home, and why couldn't I bide there? The Trumpet-Major drew Bob's discourse off the subject as soon as he could, and Bob, after some unconsidered replies and remarks, seemed willing to avoid it for the present. He did not ask John to accompany him home, as he had intended, and on leaving the barracks turned southward and entered the town to wander about till he could decide what to do. It was the 3rd of September, but the King's watering place still retained its summer aspect. The royal bathing machine had been drawn out just as Bob reached Gloucester Buildings, and he waited a minute, in the lack of other distraction, to look on. Immediately that the King's machine had entered the water, a group of florid men with fiddles, violoncellos, a trombone, and a drum, came forward, packed themselves into another machine that was in waiting, and were drawn out into the waves in the King's rear. All that was to be heard for a few minutes were the slow pulsations of the sea, and then a deafening noise burst from the interior of the second machine with power enough to split the boards asunder. It was the condensed mass of musicians inside, striking up the strains of God Save the King as His Majesty's head rose from the water. Bob took off his hat and waited till the end of the performance, which, intended as a pleasant surprise to George III, by the loyal burghers, was possibly in the watery circumstances tolerated rather than desired by that drooping monarch. 303. Loveday then passed on to the harbour, where he remained a while, looking at the busy scene of loading and unloading craft and swabbing the decks of yachts, at the boats and barges rubbing against the quay wall, and at the houses of the merchants, some ancient structures of solid stone, others green-shuttered with heavy wooden bow windows which appeared as if about to drop into the harbour by their own weight. All these things he gazed upon, and thought of one thing, that he had caused great misery to his brother John. The town clock struck, and Bob retraced his steps till he again approached the esplanade and Gloucester Lodge, where the morning sun blazed in upon the house fronts, and not a spot of shade seemed to be attainable. A huzzing attracted his attention, and he observed that a number of people had gathered before the King's residence, where a brown curricle had stopped, out of which stepped a hale man in the prime of life, wearing a blue uniform, gilt epaulets, cocked hat, and sword, who crossed the pavement and went in. Bob went up and joined the group. "What's going on?" he said. "Captain Hardy," replied a bystander. "What of him?" "Just gone in, waiting to see the King." "But the captain is in the West Indies." "No. The fleet is come home, they can't find the French anywhere." "Will they go and look for them again?" asked Bob. "Oh yes. Nelson is determined to find 'em. As soon as he's refitted he'll put to sea again. Ah, here's the King coming in." Bob was so interested in what he had just heard that he scarcely noticed the arrival of the King, and a body of attendant gentlemen. He went on thinking of his new knowledge. Captain Hardy was come. He was doubtless staying with his family at their small manor house at Pos Ham, a few miles from Overcombe, where he usually spent the intervals between his different cruises. Loveday returned to the mill without further delay, and shortly explaining that John was very well, and would come soon, went on to talk of the arrival of Nelson's captain. "And is he come at last?" said the miller, throwing his thoughts years backward. "Well can I mind when he first left home to go on board the Helena as midshipman. That's not much to remember." "I can remember it too," said Mrs. Loveday. "'Tis more than 20 years ago anyhow. And more than that, I can mind when he was born. I was a lad, serving my apprenticeship at the time. He has been in this house often and often when I was young. When he came home after his first voyage he stayed about here a long time, and used to look in at the mill whenever he went past. 'What will you be next, sir?' said mother to him one day as he stood with his back to the doorpost. 'A lieutenant, Dame Loveday,' says he. 'And what next?' says she. 'A commander.' 'And next?' 'Next, post captain.' 'And then?' 'Then it will be almost time to die.' I'd warrant that he'd mind it to this very day if you were to ask him." Bob heard all this with a manner of preoccupation, and soon retired to the mill. Thence he went to his room by the back passage, and taking his old seafaring garments from a dark closet in the wall conveyed them to the loft at the top of the mill, where he occupied the remaining spare moments of the day in brushing the mildew from their folds, and hanging each article by the window to get aired. In the evening he returned to the loft, and dressing himself in the old soled suit, went out of the house unobserved by anybody, and ascended the road towards Captain Hardy's native village and present temporary home. The shadeless downs were now brown with the droughts of the passing summer, and few living things met his view, the natural rotundity of the elevation being only occasionally disturbed by the presence of a barrow, a thorn bush, or a piece of dry wall which remained from some attempted enclosure. By the time that he reached the village it was dark, and the larger stars had begun to shine when he walked up to the door of the old-fashioned house which was the family residence of this branch of the South Wessex Hardys. "Will the captain allow me to wait on him tonight?" inquired Loveday, explaining who and what he was. The servant went away for a few minutes, and then told Bob that he might see the captain in the morning. "If that's the case, I'll come again," replied Bob, quite cheerful that failure was not absolute. He had left the door but a few steps when he was called back and asked if he had walked all the way from Overcombe Mill on purpose. Loveday replied modestly that he had done so. "Then will you come in?" He followed the speaker into a small study or office, and in a minute or two Captain Hardy entered. The captain at this time was a bachelor of 35, rather stout in build, with light eyes, bushy eyebrows, a square broad face, plenty of chin, and a mouth whose corners played between humor and grimness. He surveyed Loveday from top to toe. "Robert Loveday, sir, son of the miller at Overcombe," said Bob, making a low bow. "Ah! I remember your father," Loveday the gallant seaman replied. "Well, what do you want to say to me?" Seeing that Bob found it rather difficult to begin, he leant leisurely against the mantelpiece, and went on, "Is your father well and hearty?" "I have not seen him for many, many years. Quite well, thank ye. You used to have a brother in the army, I think. What was his name, John? A very fine fellow, if I recollect. Yes, Cap'n, he's there still. And you are in the merchant service. Late first mate of the brig Peewit. How is it you're not on board a man of war? Sir, that's the thing I've come about, said Bob, recovering confidence. I should have been, but tease womankind has hampered me. I've waited and waited on at home because of a young woman, lady, I might have said, for she's sprung from a higher class of society than I. Her father was a landscape painter, maybe you've heard of him, sir. The name is Garland. He painted that view of our village here, said Captain Hardy, looking towards a dark little picture in the corner of the room. Bob looked, and went on, as if to the picture, well, sir, I have found that, however, the press gang came a week or two ago, and didn't get hold of me. I didn't care to go aboard as a pressed man. There has been a severe impressment. It is of course a disagreeable necessity, but it can't be helped. Since then, sir, something has happened that makes me wish they had found me, and I have come tonight to ask if I could enter on board your ship the Victory. The captain shook his head severely, and presently observed, I am glad to find that you think of entering the service, Loveday. Smart men are badly wanted. But it will not be in your power to choose your ship. Well, sir, then I must take my chance elsewhere, said Bob, his face indicating the disappointment he would not fully express. 'Twas only that I felt I would much rather serve under you than anybody else, my father and all of us being known to ye, Captain Hardy, and our families belonging to the same parts. Captain Hardy took Bob's attitude more carefully. Are you a good practical seaman? He asked musingly. Sir, I believe I am. Active. Fond of skylarking. Well, I don't know about the last. I think I can say I am active enough. I could walk the yardarm, if required, cross from mast to mast by the stays, and do what most fellows do who call themselves spry. The captain then put some questions about the details of navigation, which Loveday, having luckily been used to square rigs, answered satisfactorily. As to reefing topsails, he added, if I don't do it like a flash of lightning, I can do it so that they will stand blowing weather. The Peewit was not a dull vessel, and when we were convoyed home from Lisbon, she could keep well in sight of the frigate scudding at a distance, by putting on full sail. We had enough hands aboard to reef topsails man-o'-war fashion, which is a rare thing in these days, sir, now that able seamen are so scarce on trading craft. And I hear that men from square-rigged vessels are liked much the best in the navy, as being more ready for use. So that I shouldn't be altogether so raw, said Bob earnestly, if I could enter on your ship, sir. Still, if I can't, I can't. I might ask for you, Loveday, said the captain thoughtfully, and so get you there that way. In short, I think I may say I will ask for you. So consider it settled. My thanks to you, sir, said Loveday. You are aware that the Victory is a smart ship, and that cleanliness and order are, of necessity, more strictly insisted upon there than in some others. Sir, I quite see it. Well, I hope you will do your duty as well on a line of battle ship as you did when mate of the brig, for it is a duty that may be serious. Bob replied that it should be his one endeavor, and receiving a few instructions for getting on board the guard ship, and being conveyed to Portsmouth, he turned to go away. You'll have a stiff walk before you fetch Overcombe Mill this dark night, Loveday concluded the captain, peering out of the window. I'll send you in a glass of grog to help ye on your way. The captain then left Bob to himself, and when he had drunk the grog that was brought in he started homeward, with a heart not exactly light, but large with a patriotic cheerfulness, which had not diminished when, after walking so fast in his excitement as to be beaded with perspiration, he entered his father's door. They were all sitting up for him, and at his approach anxiously raised their sleepy eyes, for it was nearly 11 o'clock. There, I knew he'd not be much longer, cried Anne, jumping up and laughing, in her relief. They have been thinking you were very strange and silent today, Bob. You were not, were you? What's the matter, Bob? Said the miller, for Bob's countenance was sublimed by his recent interview, like that of a priest just come from the penetralia of the temple. He's in his mate's clothes, just as when he came home, observed Mrs. Loveday. They all saw now that he had something to tell. I am going away, he said when he had sat down. I am going to enter on board a man of war, and perhaps it will be the Victory. Going, said Anne faintly. Now, don't you mind it, there's a dear, he went on solemnly, taking her hand in his own. And you, father, don't you begin to take it to heart. The miller was looking grave. The press gang has been here, and though I showed them that I was a free man, I am going to show everybody that I can do my duty. Neither of the other three answered, Anne and the miller having their eyes bent upon the ground, and the former trying to repress her tears. Now don't you grieve, either of you, he continued, nor vex yourselves that this has happened. Please not to be angry with me, father, for deserting you and the mill, where you want me, for I must go. For these 3 years we and the rest of the country have been in fear of the enemy, trade has been hindered, poor folk made hungry, and many rich folk made poor. There must be a deliverance, and it must be done by sea. I have seen Captain Hardy, and I shall serve under him if so be I can. Captain Hardy? Yes. I have been to his house at Pos Ham, where he's staying with his sisters, walked there and back, and I wouldn't have missed it for 50 guineas. I hardly thought he would see me, but he did see me. And he hasn't forgot you. Bob then opened his tale in order, relating graphically the conversation to which he had been a party, and they listened with breathless attention. Well, if you must go, you must, said the miller with emotion, but I think it somewhat hard that, of my 2 sons, neither one of them can be got to stay and help me in my business as I get old. Don't trouble and vex about it, said Mrs. Loveday soothingly. They are both instruments in the hands of Providence, chosen to chastise that Corsican ogre, and do what they can for the country in these trying years. That's just the shape of it, Mrs. Loveday, said Bob. And he'll come back soon, she continued, turning to Anne. And then he'll tell us all he has seen, and the glory that he's won, and how he has helped to sweep that scourge party off the earth. When be you going, Bob? His father inquired. Tomorrow, if I can. I shall call at the barracks and tell John as I go by. When I get to Portsmouth, a burst of sobs in quick succession interrupted his words. They came from Anne, who till that moment had been sitting as before with her hand in that of Bob, and apparently quite calm. Mrs. Loveday jumped up, but before she could say anything to soothe the agitated girl she had calmed herself with the same singular suddenness that had marked her giving way. I don't mind Bob's going, she said. I think he ought to go. Don't suppose, Bob, that I want you to stay. After this she left the apartment, and went into the little side room where she and her mother usually worked. In a few moments Bob followed her. When he came back he was in a very sad and emotional mood. Anybody could see that there had been a parting of profound anguish to both. She is not coming back tonight, he said. You will see her tomorrow before you go, said her mother. I may or I may not, he replied. Father and Mrs. Loveday, do you go to bed now? I have got to look over my things and get ready, and it will take me some little time. If you should hear noises you will know it is only myself moving about. When Bob was left alone he suddenly became brisk, and set himself to overhaul his clothes and other possessions in a business-like manner. By the time that his chest was packed, such things as he meant to leave at home folded into cupboards, and what was useless destroyed, it was past 2 o'clock. Then he went to bed, so softly that only the creak of one weak stair revealed his passage upward. At the moment that he passed Anne's chamber door her mother was bending over her as she lay in bed, and saying to her, "Won't you see him in the morning?" "No, no," said Anne. "I would rather not see him. I have said that I may. But I shall not. I cannot see him again." When the family got up next day Bob had vanished. It was his way to disappear like this, to avoid affecting scenes at parting. By the time that they had sat down to a gloomy breakfast, Bob was in the boat of a Budmouth waterman, who pulled him alongside the guardship in the roads, where he laid hold of the man rope, mounted, and disappeared from external view. In the course of the day the ship moved off, set her royals, and made sail for Portsmouth, with 500 new hands for the service on board, consisting partly of pressed men and partly of volunteers, among the latter being Robert Loveday. A speck on the sea in parting from John, who accompanied him to the quay, Bob had said, "Now, Jack, these be my last words to you, I give her up. I go away on purpose, and I shall be away a long time. If in that time she should list over towards ye ever so little, mind you take her. You have more right to her than I. You chose her when my mind was elsewhere, and you best deserve her, for I have never known you forget one woman, while I forgot a dozen. Take her then, if she will come, and God bless both of ye. Another person besides John saw Bob go. That was Derriman, who was standing by a bollard a little further up the quay. He did not repress his satisfaction at the sight. John looked towards him with an open gaze of contempt, for the cuffs administered to the yeoman at the inn had not, so far as the Trumpet-Major was aware, produced any desire to avenge that insult, John being, of course, quite ignorant that Festus had erroneously retaliated upon Bob, in his peculiar though scarcely soldierly way. Finding that he did not even now approach him, John went on his way, and thought over his intention of preserving intact the love between Anne and his brother. He was surprised when he next went to the mill to find how glad they all were to see him. From the moment of Bob's return to the bosom of the deep, Anne had had no existence on land. People might have looked at her human body and said she had flitted thence. The sea and all that belonged to the sea was her daily thought and her nightly dream. She had the whole 32 winds under her eye, each passing gale that ushered in returning autumn being mentally registered, and she acquired a precise knowledge of the direction in which Portsmouth, Brest, Ferrol, Cadiz, and other such likely places lay. Instead of saying her own familiar prayers at night, she substituted, with some confusion of thought, the forms of prayer to be used at sea. John at once noticed her lorn, abstracted looks, pitied her, how much he pitied her, and asked when they were alone if there was anything he could do. "There are two things," she said, with almost childish eagerness in her tired eyes. "They shall be done. The first is to find out if Captain Hardy has gone back to his ship, and the other is, oh, if you will do it, John, to get me newspapers whenever possible." After this duologue John was absent for a space of 3 hours, and they thought he had gone back to barracks. He entered, however, at the end of that time, took off his forage cap, and wiped his forehead. "You look tired, John," said his father. "Oh no." He went through the house till he had found Anne Garland. "I have only done one of those things," he said to her. "What, already? I didn't hope for or mean today. Captain Hardy is gone from Pos Ham. He left some days ago. We shall soon hear that the fleet has sailed. You have been all the way to Pos Ham on purpose. How good of you. Well, I was anxious to know myself when Bob is likely to leave. I expect now that we shall soon hear from him." 2 days later he came again. He brought a newspaper, and what was better, a letter for Anne, franked by the first lieutenant of the Victory. "Then he's aboard her," said Anne, as she eagerly took the letter. It was short, but as much as she could expect in the circumstances, and informed them that the captain had been as good as his word, and had gratified Bob's earnest wish to serve under him. The ship, with Admiral Lord Nelson on board, and accompanied by the frigate Euryalus, was to sail in 2 days for Plymouth, where they would be joined by others, and thence proceed to the coast of Spain. Anne lay awake that night thinking of the Victory, and of those who floated in her. To the best of Anne's calculation, that ship of war would, during the next 24 hours, pass within a few miles of where she herself then lay. Next to seeing Bob, the thing that would give her more pleasure than any other in the world was to see the vessel that contained him, his floating city, his sole dependence in battle and storm, upon whose safety from winds and enemies hung all her hope. The morrow was market day at the seaport, and in this she saw her opportunity. A carrier went from Overcombe at 6 o'clock thither, and having to do a little shopping for herself, she gave it as a reason for her intended day's absence, and took a place in the van. When she reached the town it was still early morning, but the borough was already in the zenith of its daily bustle and show. The king was always out of doors by 6 o'clock, and such cock-crow hours at Gloucester Lodge produced an equally forward stir among the population. She alighted, and passed down the esplanade, as fully thronged by persons of fashion at this time of mist and level sunlight as a watering place in the present day is at 4 in the afternoon. Dashing bucks and beaux in cocked hats, black feathers, ruffles, and frills, stared at her as she hurried along. The beach was swarming with bathing women, wearing waistbands that bore the national refrain, "God Save the King," in gilt letters. The shops were all open, and Sergeant Stanner, with his sword-stuck banknotes and heroic gaze, was beating up at 2 guineas and a crown, the crown to drink His Majesty's health. She soon finished her shopping, and then, crossing over into the old town, pursued her way along the coast road to Portland. At the end of an hour she had been rowed across the Fleet, which then lacked the convenience of a bridge, and reached the base of Portland Hill. The steep incline before her was dotted with houses, showing the pleasant peculiarity of one man's doorstep being behind his neighbor's chimney, and slabs of stone as the common material for walls, roof, floor, pigsty, stable manger, door scraper, and garden stile. Anne gained the summit, and followed along the central track over the huge lump of freestone which forms the peninsula, the wide sea prospect extending as she went on. Weary with her journey, she approached the extreme southerly peak of rock, and gazed from the cliff at Portland Bill, or Beale, as it was in those days more correctly called. The wild, herbless, weather-worn promontory was quite a solitude, and, saving the one old lighthouse about 50 yards up the slope, scarce a mark was visible to show that humanity had ever been near the spot. Anne found herself a seat on a stone, and swept with her eyes the tremulous expanse of water around her that seemed to utter a ceaseless unintelligible incantation. Out of the 360 degrees of her complete horizon 250 were covered by waves, the coup d'eil including the area of troubled waters known as the Race, where 2 seas met to effect the destruction of such vessels as could not be mastered by one. She counted the craft within her view. There were 5, no, there were only 4, no, there were 7, some of the specks having resolved themselves into 2. They were all small coasters, and kept well within sight of land. Anne sank into a reverie. Then she heard a slight noise on her left hand, and turning beheld an old sailor, who had approached with a glass. He was leveling it over the sea in a direction to the southeast, and somewhat removed from that in which her own eyes had been wandering. Anne moved a few steps thitherward, so as to unclose to her view a deeper sweep on that side, and by this discovered a ship of far larger size than any which had yet dotted the main before her. Its sails were for the most part new and clean, and in comparison with its rapid progress before the wind the small brigs and ketches seemed standing still. Upon this striking object the old man's glass was bent. "What do you see, sailor?" she asked. "Almost nothing," he answered. "My sight is so gone off lately that things, one and all, be but a November mist to me. And yet I fain would see today. I am looking for the Victory." "Why," she said quickly, "I have a son aboard her. He's one of 3 from these parts. There's the captain, there's my son Ned, and there's young Loveday of Overcombe, he that lately joined." "Shall I look for you?" said Anne, after a pause. "Certainly, Miss S., if so be you please." Anne took the glass, and he supported it by his arm. "It is a large ship," she said, "with 3 masts, 3 rows of guns along the side, and all her sails set." "I guessed as much. There is a little flag in front, over her bowsprit." "The Jack. And there's a large one flying at her stern." "The ensign. And a white one on her foretopmast." "That's the Admiral's flag, the flag of my Lord Nelson." "What is her figurehead, my dear?" "A coat of arms, supported on this side by a sailor." Her companion nodded with satisfaction. "On the other side of that figurehead is a marine. She is twisting round in a curious way, and her sails sink in like old cheeks, and she shivers like a leaf upon a tree. She is in stays, for the larboard tack. I can see what she's been doing. She's been reaching close in to avoid the flood tide, as the wind is to the sou-west, and she's bound down, but as soon as the ebb made, do ye see, they made sail to the west'ard. Captain Hardy may be depended upon for that, he knows every current about here, being a native. And now I can see the other side, it is a soldier where a sailor was before." "You are sure it is the Victory?" "I am sure." After this a frigate came into view, the Euryalus, sailing in the same direction. Anne sat down, and her eyes never left the ships. "Tell me more about the Victory," she said. "She is the best sailor in the service, and she carries 100 guns. The heaviest be on the lower deck, the next size on the middle deck, the next on the main and upper decks. My son Ned's place is on the lower deck, because he's short, and they put the short men below. Bob, though not tall, was not likely to be specially selected for shortness. She pictured him on the upper deck, in his snow-white trousers and jacket of navy blue, looking perhaps towards the very point of land where she then was. The great silent ship, with her population of blue jackets, marines, officers, captain, and the admiral who was not to return alive, passed like a phantom the meridian of the bill. Sometimes her aspect was that of a large white bat, sometimes that of a grey one. In the course of time the watching girl saw that the ship had passed her nearest point, the breadth of her sails diminished by foreshortening, till she assumed the form of an egg on end. After this something seemed to twinkle, and Anne, who had previously withdrawn from the old sailor, went back to him, and looked again through the glass. The twinkling was the light falling upon the cabin windows of the ship's stern. She explained it to the old man. Then we see now what the enemy have seen but once. That was in 79, when she sighted the French and Spanish fleet off Scilly, and she retreated because she feared a landing. Well, 'tis a brave ship and she carries brave men. Anne's tender bosom heaved, but she said nothing, and again became absorbed in contemplation. The Victory was fast dropping away. She was on the horizon, and soon appeared hull down. That seemed to be like the beginning of a greater end than her present vanishing. Anne Garland could not stay by the sailor any longer, and went about a stone's throw off, where she was hidden by the inequality of the cliff from his view. The vessel was now exactly end on, and stood out in the direction of the start, her width having contracted to the proportion of a feather. She sat down again, and mechanically took out some biscuits that she had brought, foreseeing that her waiting might be long. But she could not eat one of them. Eating seemed to jar with the mental tenseness of the moment, and her undeviating gaze continued to follow the lessened ship with the fidelity of a balanced needle to a magnetic stone, all else in her being motionless. The courses of the Victory were absorbed into the main, then her topsails went, and then her topgallants. She was now no more than a dead fly's wing on a sheet of spider's web, and even this fragment diminished. Anne could hardly bear to see the end, and yet she resolved not to flinch. The Admiral's flag sank behind the watery line, and in a minute the very truck of the last topmast stole away. The Victory was gone. Anne's lip quivered as she murmured, without removing her wet eyes from the vacant and solemn horizon, "They that go down to the sea in ships, that do business in great waters, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep," was returned by a man's voice from behind her. Looking round quickly, she saw a soldier standing there, and the grave eyes of John Loveday bent on her. "'Tis what I was thinking," she said, trying to be composed. "You were saying it," he answered gently. "Was I? I did not know it." "How came you here?" she presently added. "I have been behind you a good while, but you never turned round." "I was deeply occupied," she said in an undertone. "Yes, I too came to see him pass. I heard this morning that Lord Nelson had embarked, and I knew at once that they would sail immediately. The Victory and Euryalus are to join the rest of the fleet at Plymouth." There was a great crowd of people assembled to see the Admiral off. They cheered him and the ship as she dropped down. "He took his coffin on board with him, they say." "His coffin," said Anne, turning deadly pale. "Something terrible, then, is meant by that. Oh, why would Bob go in that ship? Doomed to destruction from the very beginning like this. It was his determination to sail under Captain Hardy, and under no one else," said John. "There may be hot work, but we must hope for the best." and observing how wretched she looked, he added, "But won't you let me help you back? If you can walk as far as Hope Cove it will be enough. A lerret is going from there across the bay homeward to the harbor in the course of an hour. It belongs to a man I know, and they can take one passenger, I am sure." She turned her back upon the channel, and by his help soon reached the place indicated. The boat was lying there as he had said. She found it to belong to the old man who had been with her at the bill, and was in charge of his 2 younger sons. The Trumpet-Major helped her into it over the slippery blocks of stone. One of the young men spread his jacket for her to sit on, and as soon as they pulled from shore John climbed up the blue-grey cliff, and disappeared over the top, to return to the mainland by road. Anne was in the town by 3 o'clock. The trip in the stern of the lerret had quite refreshed her, with the help of the biscuits, which she had at last been able to eat. The van from the port to Overcombe did not start till 4 o'clock, and feeling no further interest in the gaieties of the place, she strolled on past the King's house to the outskirts, her mind settling down again upon the possibly sad fate of the Victory when she found herself alone. She did not hurry on, and finding that even now there wanted another half-hour to the carrier's time, she turned into a little lane to escape the inspection of the numerous passers-by. Here all was quite lonely and still, and she sat down under a willow tree, absently regarding the landscape, which had begun to put on the rich tones of declining summer, but which to her was as hollow and faded as a theatre by day. She could hold out no longer. Burying her face in her hands, she wept without restraint. Some yards behind her was a little spring of water, having a stone margin round it to prevent the cattle from treading in the sides and filling it up with dirt. While she wept, 2 elderly gentlemen entered unperceived upon the scene, and walked on to the spring's brink. Here they paused and looked in, afterwards moving round it, and then stooping as if to smell or taste its waters. The spring was, in fact, a sulphurous one, then recently discovered by a physician who lived in the neighborhood, and it was beginning to attract some attention, having by common report contributed to effect such wonderful cures as almost passed belief. After a considerable discussion, apparently on how the pool might be improved for better use, one of the 2 elderly gentlemen turned away, leaving the other still probing the spring with his cane. The first stranger, who wore a blue coat with gilt buttons, came on in the direction of Anne Garland, and seeing her sad posture went quickly up to her, and said abruptly, "What is the matter?" Anne, who in her grief had observed nothing of the gentleman's presence, withdrew her handkerchief from her eyes and started to her feet. She instantly recognized her interrogator as the king. What, crying, His Majesty inquired kindly. "How is this?" "I have seen a dear friend go away, sir," she faltered, with downcast eyes. "Ah, partings are sad, very sad, for us all. You must hope your friend will return soon." "Where is he or she gone?" "I don't know, Your Majesty." "Don't know, how is that?" "He is a sailor on board the Victory." "Then he has reason to be proud," said the king with interest. he is your brother." Anne tried to explain what he was, but could not, and blushed with painful heat. "Well, well, well, what is his name?" In spite of Anne's confusion and low spirits, her womanly shrewdness told her at once that no harm could be done by revealing Bob's name, and she answered, "His name is Robert Loveday, sir." "Loveday, a good name. I shall not forget it. Now dry your cheeks, and don't cry any more. Loveday, Robert Loveday." Anne curtsied. The king smiled good-humouredly, and turned to rejoin his companion, who was afterwards heard to be Dr. the physician in attendance at Gloucester Lodge. This gentleman had in the meantime filled a small phial with the medicinal water, which he carefully placed in his pocket, and on the king coming up they retired together and disappeared. Thereupon Anne, now thoroughly aroused, followed the same way with a gingerly tread, just in time to see them get into a carriage which was in waiting at the turning of the lane. She quite forgot the carrier, and everything else in connection with riding home. Flying along the road rapidly and unconsciously, when she awoke to a sense of her whereabouts, she was so near to overcome as to make the carrier not worth waiting for. She had been borne up in this hasty spurt at the end of a weary day by visions of Bob promoted to the rank of admiral, or something equally wonderful, by the king's special command, the chief result of the promotion being, in her arrangement of the piece, that he would stay at home and go to sea no more. But she was not a girl who indulged in extravagant fancies long, and before she reached home she thought that the king had probably forgotten her by that time, and her troubles, and her lover's name. XXXV. A sailor enters the remaining fortnight of the month of September passed away, with a general decline from the summer's excitements. The royal family left the watering place the first week in October, the German Legion with their artillery about the same time. The dragoons still remained at the barracks just out of the town, and John Loveday brought to Anne every newspaper that he could lay hands on, especially such as contained any fragment of shipping news. This threw them much together, and at these times John was often awkward and confused, on account of the unwanted stress of concealing his great love for her. Her interests had grandly developed from the limits of Overcombe and the town life hard by, to an extensiveness truly European. During the whole month of October, however, not a single grain of information reached her, or anybody else, concerning Nelson and his blockading squadron off Cadiz. There were the customary bad jokes about Bonaparte, especially when it was found that the whole French army had turned its back upon Boulogne and set out for the Rhine. Then came accounts of his march through Germany and into Austria, but not a word about the victory. At the beginning of autumn John brought news which fearfully depressed her. The Austrian General Mack had capitulated with his whole army. Then were revived the old misgivings as to invasion. Instead of having to cope with him weary with waiting, we shall have to encounter this man fresh from the fields of victory, ran the newspaper article. But the week which had led off with such a dreary piping was to end in another key. On the very day when Mack's army was piling arms at the feet of its conqueror, a blow had been struck by Bob Loveday and his comrades which eternally shattered the enemy's force by sea. 4 days after the receipt of the Austrian news, Corporal Tuledge ran into the miller's house to inform him that on the previous Monday, at 11 in the morning, the pickle schooner, Lieutenant Le Penotier, had arrived at Falmouth with dispatches from the fleet, that the stagecoaches on the highway through Wessex to London were chalked with the words "Great Victory," "Glorious Triumph," and so on, and that all the country people were wild to know particulars. On Friday afternoon John arrived with authentic news of the battle off Cape Trafalgar, and the death of Nelson. Captain Hardy was alive, though his escape had been narrow enough, his shoe buckle having been carried away by a shot. It was feared that the Victory had been the scene of the heaviest slaughter among all the ships engaged, but as yet no returns of killed and wounded had been issued, beyond a rough list of the numbers in some of the ships. The suspense of the little household in Overcombe Mill was great in the extreme. John came thither daily for more than a week, but no further particulars reached England till the end of that time, and then only the meagre intelligence that there had been a gale immediately after the battle, and that many of the prizes had been lost. Anne said little to all these things, and preserved a superstratum of calmness on her countenance, but some inner voice seemed to whisper to her that Bob was no more. Miller Loveday drove to Pos Ham several times to learn if the captain's sisters had received any more definite tidings than these flying reports, but that family had heard nothing which could in any way relieve the miller's anxiety. When at last, at the end of November, there appeared a final and revised list of killed and wounded as issued by Admiral Collingwood, it was a useless sheet to the Lovedays. To their great pain it contained no names but those of officers, the friends of ordinary seamen and marines being in those good old days left to discover their losses as best they might. Anne's conviction of her loss increased with the darkening of the early winter time. Bob was not a cautious man who would avoid needless exposure, and 150 of the Victory's crew had been disabled or slain. Anybody who had looked into her room at this time would have seen that her favorite reading was the Office for the Burial of the Dead at Sea, beginning "We therefore commit his body to the deep." In these first days of December several of the victorious fleet came into port, but not the Victory. Many supposed that that noble ship, disabled by the battle, had gone to the bottom in the subsequent tempestuous weather, and the belief was persevered until it was told in the town and port that she had been seen passing up the Channel. 2 days later the Victory arrived at Portsmouth. Then letters from survivors began to appear in the public prints which John so regularly brought to Anne, but though he watched the mails with unceasing vigilance there was never a letter from Bob. It sometimes crossed John's mind that his brother might still be alive and well, and that in his wish to abide by his expressed intention of giving up an and home life he was deliberately lax in writing. If so, Bob was carrying out the idea too thoughtlessly by half, as could be seen by watching the effects of suspense upon the fair face of the victim, and the anxiety of the rest of the family. It was a clear day in December. The first slight snow of the season had been sifted over the earth, and one side of the apple tree branches in the miller's garden was touched with white, though a few leaves were still lingering on the tops of the younger trees. A short sailor of the Royal Navy, who was not Bob, nor anything like him, crossed the mill court and came to the door. The miller hastened out and brought him into the room, where John, Mrs. Loveday, and Anne Garland were all present. "I'm from aboard the Victory," said the sailor. "My name's Jim Cornick. And your lad is alive and well." They breathed rather than spoke their thankfulness and relief, the miller's eyes being moist as he turned aside to calm himself, while Anne, having first jumped up wildly from her seat, sank back again under the almost insupportable joy that trembled through her limbs to her utmost finger. "I've come from Spithead to Posham," the sailor continued, "and now I am going on to father at Budmouth." "Ah, I know your father," cried the Trumpet-Major, old James Cornick. It was the man who had brought Anne in his lariat from Portland Bill. "And Bob hasn't got a scratch," said the miller. "Not a scratch," said Cornick. Loveday then bustled off to draw the visitor something to drink. Anne Garland, with a glowing blush on her face, had gone to the back part of the room, where she was the very embodiment of sweet content as she slightly swayed herself without speaking. A little tide of happiness seemed to ebb and flow through her in listening to the sailor's words, moving her figure with it. The seaman and John went on conversing. Bob had a good deal to do with barricading the hawse holes afore we were in action, and the ADML and Cap'n both were very much pleased at how 'twas done. When the ADML went up the quarter-deck ladder, Cap'n Hardy said a word or two to Bob, but what it was I don't know, for I was quartered at a gun some ways off. However, Bob saw the ADML stagger when I was wounded, and was one of the men who carried him to the cockpit. After that he and some other lads jumped aboard the French ship, and I believe they was in her when she struck her flag. What I did next I can't say, for the wind had dropped, and the smoke was like a cloud. But I got a good deal talked about, and they say there's promotion in store for N. At this point in the story Jim Cornick stopped to drink, and a low unconscious humming came from Anne in her distant corner. The faint melody continued more or less when the conversation between the sailor and the Lovedays was renewed. "We heard afore that the Victory was near knocked to pieces," said the miller. "Knocked to pieces? You'd say so if so be you could see her. Gad, her sides be battered like an old penny piece, the shot be still sticking in her wales, and her sails be like so many clap nets. We have run all the way home under jury topmasts, and as for her decks, you may swab we hot water, and you may swab we cold, but there's the blood stains, and there they'll bide." The Cap'n had a narrow escape, like many o' the rest. A shot shaved his ankle like a razor. You should have seen that man's face in the Heto battle. His features were as if they'd been cast in steel. "We rather expected a letter from Bob before this." "Well," said Jim Cornick, with a smile of toleration, "you must make allowances. The truth that he is, he's engaged just now at Portsmouth, like a good many of the rest from our ship. 'Tis a very nice young woman that he's a courting of, and I make no doubt that she'll be an excellent wife for him." "Ah," said Mrs. Loveday, in a warning tone. "Courting, wife," said the miller. They instinctively looked towards Anne. Anne had started as if shaken by an invisible hand, and a thick mist of doubt seemed to obscure the intelligence of her eyes. This was but for 2 or 3 moments. Very pale, she arose and went right up to the seaman. John gently tried to intercept her, but she passed him by. "Do you speak of Robert Loveday as courting a wife?" she asked, without the least betrayal of emotion. "I didn't see you, miss," replied Cornick, turning. "Yes, your brother have his eye on a wife, and he deserves one. I hope you don't mind." "Not in the least," she said, with a stage laugh. "I am interested, naturally." "And what is she?" "A very nice young master baker's daughter, honey." "A very wise choice of the young man's." "Is she fair or dark?" "Her hair is rather light." "I like light hair. And her name?" "Her name is Caroline." "But can it be that my story hurts ye?" "If so, yes, yes," said John, interposing anxiously. "We don't care for more just at this moment." "We do care for more," said Anne vehemently. "Tell it all, sailor." "That is a very pretty name, Caroline." "When are they going to be married?" "I don't know as how the day is settled," answered Jim, even now scarcely conscious of the devastation he was causing in one fair breast. "But from the rate the courting is scudding along at, I should say it won't be long first. If you see him when you go back, give him my best wishes," she lightly said, as she moved away. And she added, with solemn bitterness, "Say that I am glad to hear he is making such good use of the first days of his escape from the valley of the shadow of death." She went away, expressing indifference by audibly singing in the distance, "Shall we go dance the round, the round, the round, shall we go dance the round?" "Your sister is lively at the news," observed Jim Cornick. "Yes," murmured John gloomily, as he gnawed his lower lip and kept his eyes fixed on the fire. "Well," continued the man from the Victory, "I won't say that your brother's intended harnt got some ballast, which is very lucky for N, as he might have picked up with a girl without a single copper nail. To be sure there was a time we had when we got into port. It was open house for us all." And after mentally regarding the scene for a few seconds, Jim emptied his cup and rose to go. The miller was saying some last words to him outside the house. Anne's voice had hardly ceased singing upstairs. John was standing by the fireplace, and Mrs. Loveday was crossing the room to join her daughter, whose manner had given her some uneasiness, when a noise came from above the ceiling, as of some heavy body falling. Mrs. Loveday rushed to the staircase, saying, "Ah, I feared something," and she was followed by John. When they entered Anne's room, which they both did almost at one moment, they found her lying insensible upon the floor. The Trumpet-Major, his lips tightly closed, lifted her in his arms, and laid her upon the bed, after which he went back to the door to give room to her mother, who was bending over the girl with some hartshorn. Presently Mrs. Loveday looked up and said to him, "She is only in a faint, John," and her color is coming back. Now leave her to me, I will be downstairs in a few minutes, and tell you how she is." John left the room. When he gained the lower apartment, his father was standing by the chimney-piece, the sailor having gone. The Trumpet-Major went up to the fire, and, grasping the edge of the high chimney shelf, stood silent. "Did I hear a noise when I went out?" asked the elder, in a tone of misgiving. "Yes, you did," said John. "It was she, but her mother says she is better now. Father," he added impetuously, "Bob is a worthless blockhead. If there had been any good in him he would have been drowned years ago." "John, John, not too fast," said the miller. "That's a hard thing to say of your brother, and you ought to be ashamed of it." "Well, he tries me more than I can bear." "Good God! What can a man be made of to go on as he does? Why didn't he come home, or if he couldn't get leave why didn't he write? 'Tis scandalous of him to serve a woman like that." "Gently, gently. The chap have done his duty as a sailor, and though there might have been something between him and Anne, her mother, in talking it over with me, has said many times that she couldn't think of their marrying till Bob had settled down in business with me. Folks that gain victories must have a little liberty allowed 'em. Look at the Admiral himself, for that matter." John continued looking at the red coals, till hearing Mrs. Loveday's foot on the staircase, he went to meet her. "She is better," said Mrs. Loveday, "but she won't come down again today." Could John have heard what the poor girl was moaning to herself at that moment as she lay writhing on the bed, he would have doubted her mother's assurance. "If he had been dead I could have borne it, but this I cannot bear." XXV Derriman sees chances. Meanwhile Sailor Cornick had gone on his way as far as the forking roads, where he met Festus Derriman on foot. The latter, attracted by the seaman's dress, and by seeing him come from the mill, at once accosted him. Jim, with the greatest readiness, fell into conversation, and told the same story as that he had related at the mill. "Bob Loveday going to be married?" repeated Festus. "You all seem struck of a heap with that." "No, I never heard news that pleased me more." When Cornick was gone, Festus, instead of passing straight on, halted on the little bridge and meditated. Bob, being now interested elsewhere, would probably not resent the siege of Anne's heart by another. There could, at any rate, be no further possibility of that looming duel which had troubled the yeoman's mind ever since his horseplay on Anne at the house on the down. To march into the mill and propose to Mrs. Loveday for Anne before John's interest could revive in her was, to this hero's thinking, excellent discretion. The day had already begun to darken when he entered, and the cheerful fire shone red upon the floor and walls. Mrs. Loveday received him alone, and asked him to take a seat by the chimney corner, a little of the old hankering for him as a son-in-law having permanently remained with her. "Your servant, Mrs. Loveday," he said, "and I will tell you at once what I come for. You will say that I take time by the forelock when I inform you that it is to push on my long-wished-for alliance with your daughter, as I believe she is now a free woman again. "Thank you, Mr. Derriman," said the mother placidly. "But she is ill at present. I'll mention it to her when she is better. Ask her to alter her cruel resolves against me, on the score of my consuming passion for her." "In short," continued Festus, dropping his parlour language in his warmth, "I'll tell thee what, Dame Loveday, I want the maid, and must have her." Mrs. Loveday replied that that was very plain speaking. "Well, tease. But Bob has given her up. He never meant to marry her. I'll tell you, Mrs. Loveday, what I have never told a soul before. I was standing upon Budmouth Quay on that very day in last September that Bob set sail, and I heard him say to his brother John that he gave your daughter up. Then it was very unmannerly of him to trifle with her so," said Mrs. Loveday warmly. "Who did he give her up to?" Festus replied with hesitation, "He gave her up to John." "To John? How could he give her up to a man already over head and ears in love with that actress woman?" "Oh, you surprise me. Which actress is it?" "That Miss Johnson. Anne tells me that he loves her hopelessly." Festus arose. Miss Johnson seemed suddenly to acquire high value as a sweetheart at this announcement. He had himself felt a nameless attractiveness in her, and John had done likewise. John crossed his path in all possible ways. Before the yeoman had replied, somebody opened the door, and the firelight shone upon the uniform of the person they discussed. Festus nodded on recognizing him, wished Mrs. Loveday good evening, and went out precipitately. "So Bob told you he meant to break off with my Anne when he went away?" Mrs. Loveday remarked to the Trumpet-Major. "I wish I had known of it before." John appeared disturbed at the sudden charge. He murmured that he could not deny it, and then hastily turned from her and followed Derriman, whom he saw before him on the bridge. "Derriman," he shouted. Festus started and looked round. "Well, Trumpet-Major," he said blandly. "When will you have sense enough to mind your own business, and not come here telling things you have heard by sneaking behind people's backs?" demanded John hotly. "If you can't learn in any other way, I shall have to pull your ears again, as I did the other day." "You pull my ears? How can you tell that lie, when you know 'twas somebody else pulled 'em?" "Oh no, no, I pulled your ears, and thrashed you in a mild way." "You'll swear to it?" "Surely 'twas another man." "It was in the parlour at the public house, you were almost in the dark." And John added a few details as to the particular blows, which amounted to proof itself. "Then I heartily ask your pardon for saying 'twas a lie," cried Festus, advancing with extended hand and a genial smile. "Sure, if I had known 'twas you, I wouldn't have insulted you by denying it. That was why you didn't challenge me, then." "That was it. I wouldn't for the world have hurt your nice sense of honor by letting ye go unchallenged, if I had known. And now, you see, unfortunately I can't mend the mistake. So long a time has passed since it happened that the heat of my temper is gone off. I couldn't oblige ye, try how I might, for I am not a man, Trumpet-Major, that can butcher in cold blood, no, not I, nor you neither, from what I know of ye. So, willy-nilly, we must fain let it pass, eh? We must, I suppose, said John, smiling grimly. Who did you think I was, then, that night when I boxed you all round? No, don't press me, replied the yeoman. I can't reveal, it would be disgracing myself to show how very wide of the truth the mockery of wine was able to lead my senses. We will let it be buried in eternal mixins of forgetfulness. As you wish, said the Trumpet-Major loftily. But if you ever should think you knew it was me, why, you know where to find me. And Loveday walked away. The instant that he was gone, Festus shook his fist at the evening star, which happened to lie in the same direction as that taken by the dragoon. Now for my revenge. Duels. Lifelong disgrace to me if ever I fight with a man of blood below my own. There are other remedies for upper-class souls. Matilda, that's my way. Festus strode along till he reached the hall, where Cripplestraw appeared gazing at him from under the arch of the porter's lodge. Derriman dashed open the entrance hurdle with such violence that the whole row of them fell flat in the mud. Mercy, Master Festus, said Cripplestraw. Surely I says to myself when I see ye a coming, surely Master Festus is fuming like that because there's no chance of the enemy coming this year after all. See our Cripplestraw. I have been wounded to the heart, replied Derriman, with a lurid brow. And the man yet lives, and you wants your horse pistols instantly. Certainly, Master F. No, Cripplestraw, not my pistols, but my new-cut clothes, my heavy gold seals, my silver-topped cane, and my buckles that cost more money than he ever saw. Yes, I must tell somebody, and I'll tell you, because there's no other fool near. He loves her heart and soul. He's poor, she's tip-top genteel, and not rich. I am rich, by comparison. I'll court the pretty play actress, and win her before his eyes. Play actress, Master Derriman? Yes. I saw her this very day, met her by accident, and spoke to her. She's still in the town, perhaps because of him. I can meet her at any hour of the day, but I don't mean to marry her, not I. I will court her for my pastime, and to annoy him. It will be all the more death to him that I don't want her. Then perhaps he will say to me, you have taken my one ewe lamb, meaning that I am the king, and he's the poor man, as in the church verse, and he'll beg for mercy when 'tis too late, unless, meanwhile, I shall have tired of my new toy. Saddle the horse, Cripplestraw, tomorrow at 10. Full of this resolve to scourge John Loveday to the quick through his passion for Miss Johnson, Festus came out booted and spurred at the time appointed, and set off on his morning ride. Miss Johnson's theatrical engagement having long ago terminated, she would have left the royal watering place with the rest of the visitors had not matrimonial hopes detained her there. These had nothing whatever to do with John Loveday, as may be imagined, but with a stout, staid boat builder in Cove Row by the quay, who had shown much interest in her impersonations. Unfortunately, this substantial man had not been quite so attentive since the end of the season as his previous manner led her to expect, and it was a great pleasure to the lady to see Mr. Derriman leaning over the harbour bridge with his eyes fixed upon her as she came towards it after a stroll past her elderly wooer's house. "Oh, take it, you didn't tell me when I saw you last that the tooting man with the blue jacket and lace was yours devoted," began Festus. "Who do you mean?" In Matilda's ever-changing emotional interests, John Loveday was a stale and unprofitable personality. "Why, that Trumpet-Major man." "Oh. What of him?" "Come, he loves you, and you know it." She knew, at any rate, how to take the current when it served. So she glanced at Festus, folded her lips meaningly, and nodded. "I've come to cut him out." She shook her head, it being unsafe to speak till she knew a little more of the subject. "What?" said Festus, reddening. "Do you mean to say that you think of him seriously, you, who might look so much higher? Constant dropping will wear away a stone, and you should only hear his pleading. His handsome face is impressive, and his manners are, oh, so genteel. I am not rich, I am, in short, a poor lady of decayed family, who has nothing to boast of but my blood and ancestors, and they won't find a body in food and clothing. I hold the world but as the world, Derimanio, a stage where every man must play a part, and mine a sad one." She dropped her eyes thoughtfully and sighed. "We will talk of this," said Festus, much affected. "Let us walk to the lookout." She made no objection, and said, as they turned that way, "Mr. Derriman, a long time ago I found something belonging to you, but I have never yet remembered to return it." And she drew from her bosom the paper which Anne had dropped in the meadow when eluding the grasp of us on that summer.